This video is going to help you to be able to identify activities where aerobic capacity is key. It's in amber there already because I think most of us would be able to identify that aerobic capacity is key in endurance events, but we're going to take it a step further than that today and really make sure we can be specific about events where aerobic capacity is key, as well as justifying that. In terms of the specification, that means that we are moving on to this section in the video today. So when we're thinking about activities and sports where aerobic capacity is a key fitness component, we can think about two groups really, and that's athletes, where we're going to concentrate most of this video today, but also aerobic capacity is important for the general population. So we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end of the video thinking about why that is. For athletes, we need to remember and use this key acronym DRIF. And when we're thinking about general population, what we're really concentrating on there is how aerobic capacity can improve the health of the general population. Okay, so in terms of, let's take the athlete group first. This is what that acronym DRIF stands for. So the D stands for duration, R for recovery, I for intensity, F for fatigue, and the final F for fuel. So we're going to take each one of those separately now and look in detail about how we can use these words in order to justify why aerobic capacity is a key component of fitness in certain sports. So duration first of all then. Aerobic capacity is key in activities that have an extended duration because it allows the performer to work for long periods of time. So those with high aerobic capacities are able to work for extended durations. Let's use some examples. So a marathon runner or the marathon takes anywhere between just over 2 hours and 4, 5, 6 hours depending on how fit you are. Invasion games tend to last over an hour, so a football game lasts 90 minutes, hockey game 70, rugby game 80, netball 60 minutes. So all these are good examples of sports performers who would need to be able to perform for an extended duration of time. Badminton matches last around 45 minutes, tennis games about 2 hours, they can go on for much longer than that, as we know. Cross-country skiing events tend to last for about 40 minutes. So all of these are really good examples of activities where you would be at an advantage if you had the ability to perform for a long and extended duration of time. So all these performers can last for the full performance or match, or into extra time perhaps, if they have a high aerobic capacity. So the first benefit of having a high aerobic capacity is that it allows you to perform for a long duration of time and therefore last for the full length of the performance. Okay, the R in our acronym DRIF stands for recovery then. So aerobic capacity is key in activities that have periods of recovery after anaerobic bursts, because a high aerobic capacity allows players to recover more quickly after these bouts. Now, for more detail on these, on anaerobic and aerobic recovery and anaerobic bursts and bouts of exercise, take yourself to the video Aerobic Training, Recovery, Fatigue and Fuel, where we're going to look at that concept in a little bit more detail. Tennis matches include short rests between points, between games and between sets after anaerobic bouts of activity. So rallies tend to be anaerobic, high-intensity bursts of exercise, but then the format of the tennis match gives the player an opportunity to rest between the points, between the games and between the sets. Now, the higher aerobic capacity, the quicker that tennis player will recover between the points, allowing them to perform at that high intensity rally again and again and again. Basketball is an intermittent activity where players perform short bursts of anaerobic activity followed by short rests. So, for example, a basketball player might have an anaerobic burst of exercise where they jump into the air really high in order to get a rebound. and they would then perhaps pass to a teammate, and that gives them the opportunity then to rest and recover from that anaerobic bout so that they're able to perform it again really quickly. So performers in these activities recover more quickly and are therefore able to sprint or jump or whatever it is more often if they have a higher aerobic capacity. The I in the acronym DRIFT stands for intensity. So aerobic capacity is key in activities where performing at high intensity gains an advantage. So in a football game, a team might be benefit from playing high up the pitch, so pressing high up the pitch, which requires a high intensity of performance from all the team. A hockey team may benefit from hunting in pairs against the opposition. Basketball teams may benefit from running a full court press against the opposition, and some dance styles need to be performed explosively. So, for example, hip hop and at high intensity throughout in order for the performance to be deemed as effective. So, performers in all these activities who have high aerobic capacities are able to perform at higher intensities, which is going to benefit their team or their overall performance for the examples outlined above. So the first F in our acronym DRIFT stands for fatigue. Aerobic capacity is key in activities where performers need to avoid fatigue because it allows a performer to work aerobically rather than anaerobically, therefore delaying OBLAR for longer and at higher intensities. And again, for more detail on this idea of delaying anaerobic work and delaying OBLAR, take yourself to the video Aerobic Training, Recovery, Fatigue and Fuel. Football players can maintain intensity into extra time without suffering fatigue if they have a high aerobic capacity. Tennis players can maintain intensity if the match goes to 5 sets without suffering fatigue if they have a high aerobic capacity. And long distance swimmers, so we're talking here about swimming events over 800 metres, can maintain intensity to the end of the race without suffering fatigue, which would allow them to perform, for example, a sprint finish if they had a high aerobic capacity. So performers in these activities who have high aerobic capacities are able to delay fatigue, meaning they maintain their intensity to the end of their performance. And the final F in the acronym DRIFT is for fuel. Aerobic capacity is key in activities where the ability to preserve glycogen stores is an advantage because a high aerobic capacity allows a performer to use fat as fuel at a higher intensity and therefore allows them to preserve their glycogen stores. And again, for more detail on that, take yourself to the video Aerobic Training, Recovery, Fatigue and Fuel. Rugby players can sprint at the end of a game if they have a high aerobic capacity because it means that they've still got enough glycogen left at the end of a game to allow them to sprint because they've been using fat earlier on in the event. It means that they've preserved glycogen and they've still got some left at the end of the game. Road cyclists are able to sprint finish again if they have glycogen reserves left at the end of their event because they've been able to use fat earlier on and for longer and at higher intensities in their performance due to their high aerobic capacity. Performers in these activities who have high aerobic capacities can use fat as the fuel to supply energy for more of their event, meaning they still have glycogen stores remaining to use as fuel at the end of the activity for an explosive burst. So let's take a look at some examples of exam questions that you may come across. There are 2 ways that they could ask you about this really. So the first example, scenario 1, is where you would be given a sporting activity and you would have to justify why high aerobic capacity or a high VO2 max is important in that particular sport. So you would go straight to the acronym of DRIFT in order to explain or to justify why aerobic capacity is important in that sport. Now, there are 5 parts to DRIFT: duration, recovery, intensity, fatigue and fuel. That's a 5 possible marks. This question might only be a 3 or a 4 mark question. So the first thing I would be doing is saying, is which of those, duration, recovery, intensity, fatigue and fuel, are the best ones to use for the activity that they have given me. And I'm only going to talk about each one once. So a really common mistake here is, for the example here, a rugby player is to choose intensity and then give 3 or 4 examples of how a rugby player would benefit from a high intensity. So the rugby player would benefit from having a high aerobic capacity. It's important because it allows them to perform at a high intensity in a tackle. It also allows them to perform at high intensity if they were running to score a try. It also allows them to perform at a high intensity if they were running after a player to try and bring them down. We're repeating the point about intensity, which will only be on the mark scheme once. So it's really important here to hit a variety of marks on the mark scheme. Avoid repeating the same answer over and over again, just using a different example. So let's work through this for the rugby player, taking each one of those words from our acronym DRIF in turn and considering whether that is applicable and whether we should use it in our answer for the rugby player. So, is the ability to perform for a high duration and long duration of time of benefit to a rugby player? Yes, of course it is. So we could use that. So for example, we would say rugby players with high aerobic capacities are able to perform for the full 80-minute of the match. They're able to keep going for that long duration. We've got in the point about duration, we've got in something specific about rugby. It's an 80-minute game. We've picked up a mark, okay? Recovery. Does the game of rugby offer the opportunity for the player to recover after high intensity anaerobic bouts quickly and then do that again? Yes, it does, because it's an intermittent activity. So we could use that point of recovery from our DRIF acronym. So we would say rugby players with high aerobic capacities are able to recover quickly between tackles. So it means that they're able to tackle more often in the game. Perfect. We've given a specific example from rugby tackling, and we've said how that's high intensity, and that higher aerobic capacity allows a player to recover more quickly. Let's move on. Intensity. So is a rugby player who's able to perform at higher intensity at an advantage? Yes. So we can choose this one. So we would say, for example, a rugby player who has a higher aerobic capacity can perform at a higher intensity. It means they can perhaps break forward more quickly, which is going to help them and help their team break forward with the ball, run at higher intensity with the ball in order to score, okay? Fatigue. Is a rugby player who is able to delay fatigue or avoid fatigue at a benefit? Yes, of course. So we could choose this one. We might say a rugby player with a higher aerobic capacity can avoid fatigue by delaying oblar, so they can maintain a high intensity until the end of the game, which allows them to, for example, try a score in the final minute. And finally, fuel. Is a rugby player who's able to preserve and then use glycogen stores at the end of a game at an advantage? Yes, they are. So a rugby player who has a higher aerobic capacity is able to use fat fuel for more of the game, so they can preserve glycogen stores, meaning that it's available at the end of the game, for example, to allow them to make a late tackle or score a last-minute try. So for rugby, we're able to use any of those 5 words from our DRIF acronym in order to justify why aerobic capacity is a key component of fitness in that sport. Let's have a look at a marathon runner. This is one that lots of students would go to if they were to pick an activity. So again, we're gonna, if the exam gave us the example of a marathon runner, we need to think, can I apply, which of these best applies to the marathon runner? So, is a marathon runner who is able to perform for a long duration of time at an advantage? Of course they are. So we can definitely pick this one. A marathon runner with a higher aerobic capacity is able to perform for longer, which means that they can keep going for the full 26 miles of the race for well over 2 hours, okay? Recovery. Does the event of the marathon offer opportunities for recovery after high intensity bursts? Perhaps I wouldn't choose this one if I were talking about the marathon runner and this were only a 3-mark question. you might be able to, well, you could argue that in a marathon, there will be periods of higher intensity bursts, such as a hill climb or a breakaway from a group, which might then be followed by a period that offers recovery, such as a downhill portion or something like that. So you might be able to argue it, but I would think that some of the other ones are more applicable to the marathon. For example, intensity. Is a marathon runner who's able to perform at a high intensity at an advantage? Yes, of course. It means they can go faster, they're going to win the race. So I would choose this one. A marathon runner with a higher aerobic capacity is able to perform at a higher intensity, which means that they can run up hills more quickly, they're able to break away from a group quickly, and they're able to perform the full race more quickly, okay? Is a marathon runner who is able to avoid or delay fatigue at an advantage? Yes, of course. So a marathon runner with a higher aerobic capacity can avoid fatigue by delaying oblar so they can maintain a high intensity until the end of the race. That's going to allow them to be able to produce a sprint finish if necessary, or to finish strongly at the end of the race. And fuel. Is a marathon runner who's able to preserve glycogen stores to the end of the race and use fat earlier on at an advantage? Yes, they are. So a marathon runner with a higher aerobic capacity is able to use fat as a fuel for more of their race at a higher intensity of exercise. So they can preserve glycogen stores, meaning that glycogen is still available at the end of the race, for example, for a sprint finish or a really strong finish. So we've got to choose those words from drift that we're going to apply carefully to whichever example the exam question gave. The second scenario for an exam question is that the question would ask you to choose an activity of your choice. So you're asked to justify why a high aerobic capacity or a high VO2 max is important in an activity of your choice. Now, there are two stages to this. Number one, choose a suitable activity or sport. Number two, then apply drift to that activity. So do not state your sport and then try and apply drift to it. Choose a sport that's going to be really easy to apply the acronym drift to. So let's have a look at some of the best examples. So for distance running, be specific. Say the marathon. Choose the longest one. I've obviously made a spelling mistake there on marathon, but distance running, be specific with your example. The number of candidates who select a middle distance event when trying to justify aerobic capacity is unbelievable. Choose the longest one. Why not? Okay, and then apply that drift acronym to the marathon. That's easy. If you're going to choose, cycling is good, but cycling or a cyclist is vague. Choose a road cyclist, because for stage races, road cycling events are between about 30 and 100k. Obviously, if you say cyclist, then that's vague, because some cycle events are on the track and they're sprint events. Okay, so let's choose a long one that's a long duration, that needs high intensity to do well, etc., etc., and then apply drift to that. Again, we could choose a swimmer. That's a really good example, but we need to be specific. We'll choose an 800 or a 1500 freestyle swimmer, not a 200 meter butterfly swimmer. That's a sprint event, okay? Or we might choose an open water swimmer. Open water events tend to be about 10k, so they're long duration and they're applicable here. Another really good example is a skier. So cross-country skiing, though, to be specific, those events for women are 10 and for men 15k. Don't just say skiing, because that could be downhill slalom, where it's going to be really a lot more difficult to apply aerobic capacity as an advantage. And then, of course, we've got our games players, which often people forget. But we've just been through the acronym drift and really easily been able to justify why aerobic capacity is important for a rugby player. So as long as you pick a game where the duration is nice and long, like rugby or football or hockey or netball, then you can't really go wrong there. Just wanted to point out the graph as well, sorry. So we can see from the graph hit on the left hand side here variations in VO2 max between different sports, and it is those distance events like distance running, so marathon runners, who tend to have the highest VO2 maxes, pushing 80 millilitres per kilogram per minute of oxygen, which is obviously a really high VO2 max. But our hockey players and our tennis players, those games players, also have high VO2 maxes, somewhere pushing 60 millilitres per kilogram per minute of oxygen, which is a high VO2 max. So that covers our athletes then, and being able to justify why aerobic capacity is a key component of fitness in different specific sporting events. I wanted to quickly talk about the general population, because sometimes we forget that aerobic capacity is actually really important for all of us, not just for sports people. Aerobic capacity can protect against lifestyle diseases like coronary heart disease. So someone in the general population who isn't necessarily working to try and improve their aerobic performance in like the marathon or in rugby can benefit from improving their aerobic capacity, because it protects against these lifestyle diseases like coronary heart disease. It also makes everyday tasks easier to perform. For example, walking to the shops, or walking the dog, or climbing the stairs, or looking after young children. They all become easier when we have a higher aerobic capacity. So therefore, it would benefit anyone to work to improve their aerobic capacity, not just sports performers. Okay, so that concludes this section on being able to identify activities where aerobic capacity is key, and it means we have now completed this section of the specification.